We're joined now by Congressman Adam Smith, the top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman, thank you for joining us this morning. You've seen these videos. You were briefed by Admiral Bradley and others. Can you just describe what you saw and what you heard?
Well, I think Jim Himes described it really well. There were two survivors on an overturned boat, and Senator Cotton's description of it is simply not accurate. When they were finally taken out, they weren't trying to flip the boat over. The boat was clearly incapacitated. A tiny portion of it remained, capsized the bow of the boat. They had no communications device. Certainly they were unarmed. Any claim that the drugs had somehow survived that attack is hard to really square with what we saw. So it was deeply disturbing. It did not appear that these two survivors were in any position to continue the fight. And then you get into the larger issue, which you previewed, of what is the fight exactly? They were trying to bring drugs, and not even to the United States, by the way. There's no evidence. I mean, the drugs were going to some other point where they were going to be transshipped from there. And again, no congressional authorization for this. If it is a war, then there should be either congressional authorization or compliance with the War Powers Resolution. So this seems to go directly against Donald Trump's pledge to keep us out of wars. He seems to be dragging us into one without legal authorization.
Let me just pin you down on one point, because Secretary Hegseth also said yesterday that the survivors could have still been in the fight and have access to radios to link up with another boat carrying the drugs.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. There are no radios. They ought to release the video. If they release the video, then everything that the Republicans are saying will clearly be portrayed to be completely false. And people will get a look at it and they will see. The boat was adrift. It was going where the current was going to take it. And these two were trying to figure out how to survive. And the interpretation of this, that if maybe there were still drugs somewhere on that boat, that justifies the use of deadly force, is an incredible expansion of presidential power. If you say anyone who has drugs that they're intending to illegally transit to the U.S. is a legitimate target for deadly force, the amount of power that gives the president and the U.S. military is unprecedented and something that ought to be concerning to all of the American people.
On the release of the video, President Trump has said he's fine with having it released, but Secretary Hegseth also said yesterday that's still being reviewed, and he raised the possibility that they can't release it because they don't want to compromise sources and methods.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. I mean, how many videos have they released to date? I'm not sure. It's like 15 or 20. They've showed the strike. It's not very hard to make sure that nothing in that video shows anything. If they showed us just the portion that we saw of those two on the boat, it's no different than any of the dozen-plus videos they've already released. I mean, it seems pretty clear they don't want to release this video because they don't want people to see it, because it's very, very difficult to justify. And again, big issue here is President Trump's dragging us into a foreign conflict when we have domestic issues that we're supposed to be paying attention to, that we need to be paying attention to. It's directly contrary to the campaign that President Trump ran. And is this really about drugs, or is it about regime change in Venezuela? Are we about to go to war with Venezuela? The president has alluded to that repeatedly over the course of the last several weeks, couple months now. And that, too, I think would be very, very bad for the national security interests of our country.
Have you or any of your colleagues in Congress been given any briefings on the possibility of land strikes in Venezuela and taking out President Maduro?
We have not. And that's the other aspect of this Department of Defense and the president. They don't really think that Congress should be allowed to exercise their oversight. They have not kept us informed on this. They did not inform us of these strikes. The decision to go forward with this was made in late July. The execute order that the White House gave the Department of Defense was issued on August 5th. By law, they are supposed to transmit that execute order to Congress within 30 days. They haven't. They have no intention of doing so. Look, I mean, that's the biggest problem with this Department of Defense. They don't seem to think that the law applies to them. I mean, let's start with the fact it's the Department of Defense. I'm out at the Reagan Defense Forum, and they're all running around calling him the Secretary of War, the Department of War. The law states clearly it's the Department of Defense. They don't care what the law is. They do and say what they want. And look, we're going to have arguments between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Every president that I've worked with as a member of Congress has that. But all prior presidents at least gave some effort to follow the law. This one doesn't seem to want to, and the Secretary of Defense doesn't either. That undermines our representative democracy and our Constitution.
You say the Secretary of Defense doesn't want to follow the law. We also saw this Inspector General's report on the release of sensitive information on the Signal messaging app before the strikes in Yemen. Secretary Hegseth has called that a complete exoneration. Your response?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And in addition to not following law, he doesn't want any accountability. He was asked yesterday at the Defense Forum here, do you have any regrets about the way you handled that? At which point he gave a philosophical answer about how life's too short for regrets. I disagree with the Secretary on that point. It's perfectly okay to look back at past actions and say, yeah, I didn't do that right. Look, he released sensitive information on an unsecured public chat that went to a journalist. How anybody, anywhere in the national security sphere, much less the Secretary of Defense, could look at that and say, oh, good, no worries, I'd do it again. I mean, okay, you make a mistake, whatever, but admit it, you are not supposed to share that type of information. And the report says clearly, the Secretary placed our troops at unnecessary risk. So for the Secretary of Defense to look at that report and say, I placed troops at unnecessary risk, and I'm okay with that. I did nothing wrong. That's really disturbing. We need them to follow the law, and we need some measure of accountability. We can disagree on policy, a bunch of different areas, but we can't have a completely unaccountable Secretary of Defense who repeatedly ignores the law. And that's what we're battling with in Congress right now, to hold them accountable.
Finally, I want to ask you about the president's pardon of the former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez. Of course, the pardon power is absolute. Congress has no recourse to stop it. But is there anything more the public needs to know about this? Can you think of any justification for the pardon?
No. I mean, I think what the public needs to know about this, and I also like to point out the pardon of Ross Ulbricht, the Silk Road crypto guy who was setting up a secret way of using crypto to basically launder billions of dollars in drug money. He was convicted of laundering drug money, and Trump pardoned him. Look, it seems like this isn't that much about drugs coming into the U.S. It's more about what Trump released with their national security strategy a couple days ago, 3 days ago now, where he wants to assert dominance over the Western Hemisphere. He wants to go back to the 19th century, where the U.S. does what it wants in the Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine. And look, that's disturbing. For 80 years, we have tried to develop an international system that is based on law, a rules-based system. And Trump seems to want to smash that. And if he can go after Venezuela and go after Maduro, that's one way of doing it. The Honduras thing seems to have to do with the presidential election that's going on down there and the party that supports Trump or the party that doesn't support Trump. So it seems to be much more about that than any legitimate desire to stop what, by the way, is a huge problem. Drugs in the U.S. are a huge problem, but they keep, just one more example, and this fentanyl is killing a lot of people. There's no fentanyl involved in what we're blowing up down in the Caribbean, even though the White House and others keep saying that. This is cocaine, which is a problem, but if you really wanted to get after this, you'd be putting pressure on China to stop the precursors, and you'd be putting pressure on Mexico where the fentanyl comes through. This seems to be much more about President Trump's world vision of the U.S. needing to dominate the hemisphere than it does about protecting Americans from the incredible problem that we have with drug overdoses and death.
Congressman, thanks for your time this morning.